is unconstitutional and restricts their Second Amendment right to bear arms.
This comes after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down New York's restrictive handgun laws, which required a good reason to carry.
The legal challenge is now aimed at Honolulu's proposed concealed carry rules and regulations.
The Protect Illinois Communities Act bans dozens of specific brands or types of rifles and handguns.
This comes after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down New York's restrictive handgun laws, which required a good reason to carry.
A federal judge suspends key provisions of New York's new gun law.
Supreme Court steps in. The Supreme Court is stepping into a high-stakes showdown over New York City's controversial firearm permit requirements. Let's break down the drama. First up, we have Justice Sotomayor. She's the one responsible for reviewing emergency applications coming out of the Second Circuit. The plaintiffs, unhappy with New York City's rules on who can get a permit for rifles and shotguns, sought immediate intervention from the Supreme Court. They argued that the city's requirement for a permit based on good moral character, decided by the police, infringed on their Second Amendment rights. Justice Sotomayor, however, wasn't convinced. She denied their request to put a stop to these requirements while the case was still being debated in the courts. But the plaintiffs didn't throw in the towel. Instead, they took a strategic step and resubmitted their application to Justice Clarence Thomas. Now, Justice Thomas has a bit of a different reputation when it comes to the Second Amendment issues. True to form, he didn't just sit on it, he took a decisive action and sent the case to the full Supreme Court for consideration. This is a big deal because it means the entire Supreme Court will now weigh in, rather than a single justice making a call.
The Supreme Court handed down this decision, which will undo a different law. Now, this
Federal judge suspends key provisions of New York's new gun law.
Is unconstitutional and restricts their Second Amendment right to bear arms.
Mark your calendars for May 16th, folks. That's when the Supreme Court is scheduled to review this case in a conference. It's a significant development because the outcome could have major implications for gun rights and regulations across the country. The conference is where the justices will discuss the case behind closed doors and decide whether to take it up formally. If they do, it could lead to a landmark decision. So what's the big takeaway? The Supreme Court's involvement, especially with Justice Thomas in the mix, ups the ante considerably. We're looking at a potentially pivotal moment in the ongoing debate over Second Amendment rights. Will the Supreme Court strike down New York City's permit requirements, or will they uphold them? Stay tuned, because whatever happens, it's going to be a game changer. Case background and significance. This case is stirring up a lot of conversations about Second Amendment rights. At the heart of the issue is New York City's permit system for rifles and shotguns. Here's the deal. If you want to buy or possess a rifle or shotgun in NYC, you need a permit. But it's not just any permit. It's one that hinges on a good moral character assessment by the police department. Basically, the police get to decide who they think is morally fit to own these firearms. The plaintiffs in this case are challenging this requirement, arguing that it's unfair and unconstitutional. The plaintiffs have a strong case, partly because they're leaning on a recent Supreme Court decision, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. In the Bruin case, the Supreme Court struck down a similar discretionary permit process, but one that was about concealed carry licenses. The court found that requiring people to demonstrate a special need for self-defense to get a concealed carry license was unconstitutional.
This comes after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down New York's restrictive handgun laws, which required a good reason to carry.
Core reason for the Second Amendment is to provide law-abiding citizens with the ability to carry a gun for self-defense.
Applicants will have to show they understand how to use a gun, and they'll have to safeguard it when not using it.
A government figure, that the individual had a particularized need for that concealed carry permit.
The plaintiffs in Straw versus City of New York argue that the city's current permit system for rifles and shotguns is essentially the same deal, a discretionary process that infringes on their Second Amendment rights. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of the plaintiffs, the decision could have massive implications nationwide. It would challenge the validity of any firearm permit systems that involve discretionary criteria, not just in New York, but across the country. Essentially, it could mean that states and cities would no longer be able to use subjective criteria like good moral character to control who gets to exercise their right to own firearms. This would be a huge win for gun rights advocates and could lead to significant changes in how firearm permits are handled everywhere. So this case isn't just about New York. It's about setting a precedent that could reshape Second Amendment rights across the United States. Current legal status. Here's where things get a bit tangled. Initially, a federal district court sided with the plaintiffs, agreeing that the good moral character requirement was unconstitutional. The court granted a permanent injunction, which means they essentially said, "Stop enforcing this rule, it's not okay." But hold on, New York City wasn't ready to back down. They appealed the decision, and the Second Circuit Court of Appeals stepped in. The Second Circuit issued a stay on the injunction. This means that, for now, the good moral character requirement can still be enforced while the appeal process is ongoing. It's like hitting the pause button on a district court's ruling. Now enter the Supreme Court. The plaintiffs didn't want to wait for the lengthy appeals process to play out with the good moral character requirement still in effect. They filed an emergency application to the Supreme Court, asking them to lift the Second Circuit stay. If the Supreme Court grants this request, it would immediately suspend the good moral character requirement, even while the legal battles continue. This is a crucial move because it could temporarily change how firearm permits are handled in New York City right now, rather than years down the line. So what happens next? On May 16th, the Supreme Court will have a conference to decide whether to take up the case. If they decide to intervene and lift the stay, the good moral character requirement would be put on hold, altering the landscape of New York City's firearm permit process.
Proper cause requirement that the NYPD uses to determine if someone is eligible to receive a carry permit.
The Supreme Court today said you can't require someone to justify why they want to conceal carry a gun, but it was leaving open.
The legal challenge is now aimed at Honolulu's proposed concealed carry rules and regulations.
Among others, the new rules take effect September 1st and apply to new and existing applications for a permit.
Conversely, if they refuse to lift the stay, the requirement stays in effect until the full appeal is resolved, which could take a considerable amount of time. The Supreme Court's decision at this stage is critical. It will determine whether the current permit requirements will continue to be enforced while the broader constitutional questions are sorted out. This is a pivotal moment that could either maintain the status quo or bring immediate changes to gun permit regulations in New York City. Key legal arguments. The plaintiffs are confident about their chances of winning the appeal. Their main argument rests on the Supreme Court's recent decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. In Bruin, the Supreme Court struck down New York's discretionary permit process for concealed carry licenses, ruling that it violated the Second Amendment. The plaintiffs in Straw v. New York City believe that this precedent directly applies to their case. They argue that just as the Supreme Court found the concealed carry permit process unconstitutional in Bruin, it should also find New York City's discretionary good moral character requirement for rifles and shotguns unconstitutional. Another key argument from the plaintiffs is that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals made a mistake by relying on the Anonio case to justify the stay. Anonio dealt with concealed carry permits, not long guns or shotguns, and involved a different legal standard. The plaintiffs argue that the specifics of Anonio do not translate to their case. They emphasize that Anonio's analysis was narrowly focused on concealed handguns and shouldn't be used to uphold a permit system for rifles and shotguns. This, they argue, makes the Second Circuit's reliance on Anonio inappropriate and irrelevant. The plaintiffs also challenge the Second Circuit's interpretation of the Bruin decision. The Second Circuit suggested that Bruin's ruling applied only to exceptional regulations, implying that not all discretionary permit systems would be struck down under Bruin. The plaintiffs argue that this is a misreading of Bruin. They contend that the Supreme Court in Bruin did not limit its ruling to exceptional cases, but rather set a broad precedent against discretionary permit processes that lack historical support. By arguing that Bruin's principles should apply broadly, the plaintiffs aim to show that New York City's good moral character requirement is similarly unconstitutional, and that the Second Circuit's interpretation is overly restrictive and incorrect.
Hired an individual who wanted to carry a concealed weapon, a concealed handgun.
Major ruling involving the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court struck down a New York law.
The U.S. Supreme Court has just issued a major ruling in the challenge to a New York gun law.
Approved a sweeping overhaul of the state's handgun licensing rules in response to last month's landmark Supreme Court ruling.
Implications and next steps. As the Supreme Court gears up to consider the case on May 16th, they have a few paths they could take. They might decide to reschedule the case, essentially delaying a decision and allowing more time for deliberation. They could also request additional information, seeking more details before making a judgment. Another possibility is that they grant a full review of the case, which would mean a deep dive into the arguments and a formal hearing. Any of these actions will be closely scrutinized because they could significantly influence how Second Amendment issues are interpreted in the future. The May 16th conference is not just about Straw versus City of New York. The Supreme Court will also be looking at several other Second Amendment cases, including those challenging Illinois' rifle bans.
The law prohibits the possession, manufacture, or sale of semi-automatic rifles and high-capacity magazines.
The U.S. Supreme Court has once again been asked to block Illinois' assault weapons ban.
Trying to put a hold on new Illinois law that would ban high-power semi-automatic weapons.
The Protect Illinois Communities Act bans dozens of specific brands or types of rifles and handguns.
This batch of cases makes the conference a potentially watershed moment for gun rights law in the United States. The outcomes could set new precedents or reinforce existing ones, shaping the legal landscape for firearm regulations nationwide. Plaintiffs and Second Amendment advocates are crossing their fingers for a favorable outcome. They're hoping the Supreme Court either reschedules the case for a full hearing or outright grants a review. What they're really hoping to avoid is a denial, which would leave the current regulations in place and maintain the status quo. A favorable decision, on the other hand, could dismantle discretionary criteria like the good moral character requirement, leading to more uniform and potentially less restrictive firearm regulations across the country. That's all for this video, folks. We'll see you next time.